Ever heard those true crime stories that just leave you with way more questions than answers?
Oh, yeah.
That's kind of what we're getting into today.
Oh, okay.
The story of Homer
All
Jackson.
right.
It's just full of twists and turns.
Yeah.
And frankly, it leaves you wondering if anyone ever got the answers they were looking for.
Interesting.
So, we're talking about a man convicted of multiple murders, but then released
Okay.
after serving time
Yeah.
due to a plea deal that sparked a ton of controversy.
Oh, wow.
So today we're going to do a deep dive into all the facts.
Okay.
We've got a whole stack of articles and court documents.
Right.
And our mission is to really understand everything we can about this case.
Okay.
The crimes,
Yeah.
the arrest, the trial, and that unsettlingly ambiguous ending.
I'm intrigued.
So,
Yeah.
to start us off,
Okay.
Homer Jackson,
Yeah.
he was born in Berkeley, California,
Okay.
but his family moved to Portland, Oregon.
Oh, right.
And that's where everything we're talking about took place.
Got-
His early life is interesting
Yeah.
because it kind of paints a different picture
Okay.
from the man who was eventually accused of these crimes.
So like a contrast.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting.
Like he had some serious health problems from a young age,
Okay.
including like congestive heart failure and anterograde amnesia.
And that's
That's a type of amnesia
That-
where it affects your ability to form new memories.
wow.
So you can imagine how difficult that made it for him to learn.
Yeah.
He ended up dropping out of school.
Oh, so that's when things started to, I guess, go downhill.
It seems that way.
Yeah.
Between 1978 and 1983, he was arrested repeatedly for burglary,
Mm-hmm.
although he never served any really long sentences.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
he was also deeply involved in a pretty rough world,
Oh, like what kind of world?
hanging out with pimps and prostitutes,
Oh, wow.
struggling with alcohol and crack cocaine addiction.
So really living on the edge there.
Sounds like his life was on a pretty dangerous trajectory.
Yeah, it was.
But then something happened that shifted things,
Really?
at least for a while.
Okay.
He got shot,
Oh, wow.
which led to surgery,
Okay.
and they actually had to remove one of his lungs.
Wow.
It's weird to think about a violent event like that
Yeah.
as like a turning point,
Right?
but in a way it kind of was for Jackson.
Okay.
He was able to overcome his addiction
Huh.
and even got married twice.
Oh, wow. So, like, there was a period of time where things were
Relatively stable.
relatively stable for him.
For a time,
Okay.
he worked a bunch of low-skill jobs,
Mm-hmm.
and for a while he even worked for a charity
Oh, really?
that helped provide food and clothing to people in need.
So that's,
It's a far cry from the life he was living before.
it really is, yeah.
But,
So what happened to bring that period of stability to an end?
well, his second marriage ended in divorce,
Okay.
and he became increasingly isolated.
Uh-huh.
He started showing some signs of a pretty significant mental decline.
Oh, no.
In 2006, he was arrested twice.
Sir.
Once for driving under the influence,
Okay.
and then another time for reckless driving.
Hmm.
And then there was a really disturbing incident
What happened?
where he fired a rifle into the street from his apartment.
Oh, my gosh. That's terrifying what was
Like-
going on.
He claimed that someone was trying to break in,
Okay.
but he later admitted that he just made the whole thing up.
He made it up.
Yeah.
Wow.
When the police arrived, he threatened them,
Oh.
which forced them to enter his apartment
Okay.
and take him in for a psych evaluation.
So is that when he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia?
Yes.
Okay.
At that point, he was deemed unfit to stand trial
Mm-hmm.
and spent 4 years in a mental health facility,
Getting treatment.
receiving treatment. Yeah.
So by this point,
Yeah.
he's dealing with serious mental illness,
Right.
living on disability,
Mm-hmm.
struggling with all sorts of health problems.
Yeah, it paints a pretty bleak picture of his life.
It does, and it's important to remember that all this is happening before the murders he's eventually charged with.
Exactly.
Okay.
So we're talking about 4 victims.
Okay.
S.C. Carey Jackson,
Okay.
no relation.
Yeah.
Tanja Nanette Harry,
Uh-huh.
Angela Saka, Dina Anderson,
Okay.
and Latonga Lee Watts.
Gotcha. Can you tell me about them?
All 4 women were working as prostitutes when they were murdered.
Oh, wow.
They were all sexually assaulted
Okay.
and strangled.
Uh-huh.
One of the details that always stands out to me is that they were all found with their breasts exposed
Oh.
and their pants or skirts undone in some way.
That's a chilling detail, and it definitely suggests a pattern.
It does.
Yeah.
And these murders took place over a span of 10 years,
Really?
from 1983 to 1993.
Wow. That's a long time.
That's a really long time for a killer to go undetected.
It is, and what's even more striking is that it wasn't until 2015 that Homer Jackson was finally arrested and
Wow.
charged with these crimes.
22 years.
The arrest was based on forensic evidence
Okay.
that linked him to at least one of the victims.
Okay, so now we're 22 years out from the first murder.
Yeah.
And suddenly there's this break in the case
Mm-hmm.
that must have been huge for the victims' families
Right.
and the investigators who had been working on this case for years.
Absolutely. But then things take another turn.
What do you mean?
The interrogation was intense.
Yeah.
It lasted for over 2 days,
Wow.
and Jackson initially insisted that he was innocent,
Oh,
but eventually he confessed.
What do we know about the confession itself?
Well, there are a lot of questions surrounding how valid it is.
Like what?
Well, the detectives used some tactics that have been criticized,
Okay.
including putting a lot of moral pressure on Jackson and making promises about things like privileges and access to legal advice. So
Mhm.
these tactics raised red flags right away.
Yeah, and if I remember correctly, there were some inconsistencies in what Jackson actually confessed to.
Yes, exactly. There were details in his confession that were later proven to be inaccurate.
Can you give me an example?
Yeah, so, for example, he claimed to have stabbed one of the victims,
Uh-huh.
but the evidence showed that she hadn't been stabbed at all.
Oh, wow.
He also confessed to having like a special feeling for one of the victims,
Okay.
while also saying that he murdered her.
So it sounds like the confession was kind of a mess,
It really does.
which makes you wonder how much weight the prosecution could actually put on it.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we have to consider his mental state at the time.
Right.
Did his paranoid schizophrenia play a role in what he was saying?
That's a question that would become central to the case moving forward.
Okay.
But before we get into the legal battles,
Yeah.
let's talk about the forensic evidence because
Okay.
that adds a whole other layer of complexity.
All right, let's dive into that.
Okay.
We know that the defense attorney filed a motion to dismiss the charges
Uh-huh.
based on the fact that the evidence was largely circumstantial
Yeah.
and in some cases questionable.
Right.
What can you tell us about the specific discrepancies?
Okay, well, let's start with Essie Jackson, the first victim.
Okay.
The DNA found under her fingernails and the blood on her jeans didn't match Homer Jackson.
Oh, wow.
With Tanja Harry, the second victim.
Yeah.
Neither the semen nor the hairs found at the crime scene matched him.
Okay.
And DNA from cigarette butts found there didn't match him either.
So right off the bat, we're seeing these inconsistencies.
Yeah.
Did the forensic evidence connect him to the other two victims?
It's a mixed bag.
How so?
Well, with Angela Anderson,
Uh-huh.
cigarette butts found at the scene were confirmed to be his.
Okay.
But the DNA of the killer didn't match.
Huh.
And with Latonga Watts, the final victim,
Yeah.
gets even more complicated.
Okay.
Mixed DNA on her fingernail scrapings did include Jackson,
Okay.
but DNA found on her scarf, which belonged to 5 different men, didn't include him.
What?
And neither did DNA from blood and epithelial cells found on her body.
So we have this confession that's full of holes.
Yeah.
And forensic evidence that seems to raise more questions than it answers.
It does.
So what did this mean for the prosecution's case?
It put them in a difficult position, to say the least.
Yeah.
They were relying heavily on this confession
Yeah.
that was obtained under questionable circumstances.
Yeah.
And that didn't totally align with the physical evidence.
Right.
The defense was ready to pounce on these weaknesses.
Oh, I bet.
Yeah.
So it sounded like the prosecution really had their work cut out for them.
Yeah.
What happened next?
Well, in 2017, the judge made a decision that really shook things up.
What was that?
He ruled that Jackson's confession was inadmissible.
He couldn't use the confession.
No, inadmissible in court.
Wow, that must have been a big blow to the prosecution's case.
Oh, yeah. Huge.
What was the judge's reasoning?
So he cited those controversial tactics that
Right.
the police used during the interrogation.
Okay.
And he said that they created a real risk
Okay.
of a false confession
Right.
and a potential miscarriage of justice.
So basically he was saying that,
Given the pressure that Jackson was under
Yeah.
and his mental state,
yeah,
there was no way to know for sure if he was actually guilty.
or just telling the police what they wanted to hear.
Exactly.
So was
Yeah.
that the end of the confession as evidence?
Well, not quite.
Okay.
The prosecution appealed the judge's ruling
Mm-hmm.
all the way up to the Oregon Supreme Court.
Really?
But guess what? In 2018, the Supreme Court upheld the lower court's decision.
So they said the confession couldn't be used?
Nope.
Wow. Okay, so double rejection
Yeah.
of that crucial piece of evidence?
Uh-huh.
That's got to be frustrating for the prosecution.
Oh, for sure.
What was the reasoning behind that?
They looked at a few things,
Oh.
including Jackson's schizophrenia diagnosis,
Right.
his history of memory problems, and
Right.
the fact that he'd given some inaccurate information during the interrogation.
So all of this pointed to the fact that
He could have been easily coerced into confessing.
something he didn't do. So at this point,
Yeah.
you've got a confession that can't be used.
Right.
And forensic evidence that's, at best, inconclusive.
Yeah.
It seems like the case is barely hanging on.
It really was.
What happened next?
Well, the trial was postponed, of course.
Yeah.
But they did something interesting.
Right.
Prosecutors actually dropped one of the murder charges,
Right.
the one for S.E. Jackson.
Okay.
But then, get this,
What?
they added another murder charge.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
Who for?
A woman named Lawana Janelle Triplett.
Okay.
Her body was found in 1993.
Right.
And just like all the other victims,
Okay.
she was a prostitute who'd been beaten and strangled.
So they're removing one victim
Yeah.
and adding another one?
Uh-huh.
Isn't it really struggling to build a solid case here?
Yeah, they were.
So how did this affect the trial?
It pushed the trial date back even further.
Of course.
But then, in early 2020,
Okay.
Jackson's attorneys made a move.
What was that?
They filed a motion asking for him to be tried separately.
Separately.
Yeah.
For each of the 4 murders.
Uh-huh.
Why would they do that?
It was a classic divide and conquer strategy.
Well,
They basically said, look, there's not enough evidence
right.
to definitively connect these murders.
Okay.
Let's look at them individually
Uh-huh.
and see if the prosecution can really prove their case.
So what were they pointing at?
They pointed out all these inconsistencies between the cases,
Oh.
like differences in the victims' ages,
Uh-huh.
the types of injuries, the locations where the bodies were found.
So basically trying to prevent the jury from being influenced by the sheer number of charges.
Exactly.
So if they saw it as 4 separate incidents
Yeah.
rather than one big case,
Uh-huh.
it might be harder for them to just assume guilt.
Right.
Right.
And the judge agreed.
He did.
He ruled that each murder case should be tried separately.
Wow.
He said there wasn't enough evidence to conclusively link them.
Of course the prosecution wasn't happy.
Not at all.
But let's not forget,
Yeah.
this was all happening during COVID.
Oh, right.
Jackson was in his 60s
Uh-huh.
and had some serious health problems.
Yeah.
Did that factor into the legal proceedings at all?
It did.
How so?
Jackson's attorneys actually tried to get him placed under house arrest.
Really?
Yeah, at his mother's home.
Wow.
They argued that because of his weakened immune system,
Right.
being in jail during a pandemic put him at high risk of serious complications if he caught COVID.
That makes sense.
He was even hospitalized with a high fever and pneumonia
Oh,
at
wow.
one point.
So did the judge grant house arrest?
He did not.
Oh, wow.
Jackson stayed in jail.
So after all this back and forth,
Yeah.
did those 4 separate trials ever actually happen?
Well, a trial date was set for March 2022.
Okay.
But before it could begin, the DA's office appealed the decision on the separate trials.
To the Oregon Supreme Court again?
Yep,
It seems like they really wanted to try all these cases together.
it does, doesn't it? But in November 2021,
Okay.
the Supreme Court rejected the appeal.
So the path was finally clear
It was.
for those 4 separate trials to begin.
Yeah, it seemed like they were finally going to get some answers.
It did, right?
But then
Something totally unexpected happened.
a plea deal
Big deal.
was offered and Jackson accepted it.
Wait, hold on.
Yeah,
After all this time,
I know.
all these legal battles,
Uh-huh.
they settled on a plea deal.
Yep.
What were the terms?
Jackson pleaded guilty to criminally negligent homicide for all 4 victims.
Wow.
He was sentenced to 6 years and 3 months.
Okay. But
Because he'd already served that much time,
while awaiting trial,
he was released immediately.
it's almost unbelievable.
I know.
After years of this legal wrangling and uncertainty,
Mm-hmm.
it ends with him just walking free.
That's exactly what happened.
And as you can imagine, the victims' families were outraged.
Oh, yeah, they felt like he'd gotten away with murder.
Right. That the punishment didn't fit the crime.
They waited decades for some sense of justice.
They did.
And this just felt like a slap in the face.
It did.
So how did the judge justify such a lenient sentence?
Well, he took a few things into consideration.
Look what?
Jackson's mental illness was a factor,
Okay.
as was his declining health.
Right.
The judge also mentioned that original confession
Yeah.
and how questionable it was.
Mhm.
And also, the statute of limitations had expired on some of the crimes.
Oh, wow.
So legally,
Yeah.
he couldn't be prosecuted for those anyway.
So it sounds like the judge was trying to find some middle ground.
Yeah.
Taking into account the complexities of the case
Right.
and Jackson's personal circumstances.
Exactly.
But that doesn't make it any easier for the families of the victims.
It doesn't, and unfortunately the story doesn't end there.
What do you mean?
Just over a year after his release,
Okay.
in July of 2023,
Uh-huh.
Homer Jackson was found dead
Oh, my God.
at his home.
It's like, this case is just full of twists and turns.
I know.
What happened?
His sister found him.
Okay.
He was severely underweight,
Uh-huh.
and apparently he'd been in and out of the hospital for cardiopulmonary issues.
Oh, wow. So after all that,
Yeah.
he dies at home,
Uh-huh.
still carrying the weight of all these unresolved crimes.
I know, what a tragically ambiguous end.
To an already perplexing story.
It is, and while police didn't suspect foul play,
Yeah.
the official cause of death has never been released.
We're left with so many unanswered questions.
Like, did he die from complications related to his health problems?
Yeah.
Did the stress of the trial and the public scrutiny play a role?
Right. We may never know for sure.
It's kind of hard to come away from this story feeling like there's any real closure.
Yeah.
We're just left with these lingering questions about guilt and innocence
Right.
and whether justice was really served.
That's the thing about this case.
Yeah.
It really forces you to confront some hard truths about our legal system.
Like what?
We saw how things could have gone very differently
For Jackson.
for Jackson if that confession had been allowed.
It's kind of unsettling to think about how many other cases
Right.
might hinge on confessions obtained under questionable circumstances.
Exactly.
It really highlights the importance of protecting the rights of suspects.
Yes.
Especially those who are vulnerable because of mental illness.
Yes. Very good point.
Yeah, it really highlights how important it is
To protect their rights.
to protect their rights, especially when you're talking about someone who is
Vulnerable.
vulnerable due to mental illness.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then on top of that, you've got the forensic evidence.
Right.
Or in this case,
The lack of it.
the lack of it.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder, if they were so focused on Jackson
Uh-huh.
that they just overlooked other possibilities,
Right.
other potential suspects.
Those inconsistencies in the forensic evidence
Yeah.
are hard to ignore.
It's possible that Jackson was involved in some of the murders,
Right.
but not all of them,
Or maybe he was involved in a different way
right?
than they initially thought.
Than the prosecution initially thought.
Yeah, we just don't know.
And we may never know.
And we may never know.
And of course, we can't forget about the victims
Right.
and their families.
Of course.
They waited decades for answers.
Yeah, for some sense of justice.
Some sense of justice.
And the way it all ended, it must have been so disappointing.
The plea deal, while maybe the best outcome,
Yeah.
given all the legal complexities,
Wait,
probably just felt like a slap in the face after everything they'd been through.
it's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
They were denied the closure they deserved.
It really highlights how difficult it is
Yeah.
to find that balance between justice for the victims
Uh-huh.
and the rights of the accused,
Especially when you throw mental illness in there.
especially when mental illness is a factor.
Yeah.
It's a tightrope walk and there's no easy answers.
Yeah. So the justice system
Yeah.
is designed to be fair and impartial.
Right.
But it's also a human system.
Yeah,
And humans make mistakes.
they do.
And sometimes those mistakes have some pretty devastating consequences.
I think this whole deep dive
Yeah.
has shown us that truth and justice
Uh-huh.
aren't always as clear-cut as we want them to be.
The Homer Jackson case
Yeah.
is a reminder that sometimes the legal system, for
Yeah.
all of its complexities,
Yeah.
can't provide all the answers.
Sometimes it
And that ambiguity,
can be really hard to live with.
it can.
And that's why these cases stick with us.
Yeah.
They make us question our values, our
Yeah.
assumptions,
Right.
what we expect from the legal system.
We may never know the full truth about Homer Jackson, but the questions his case raises about justice and accountability
Right.
and the challenges of mental illness within the legal system,
Are questions we just have to keep asking.
they are. And I hope everyone listening,
We'll keep thinking about these questions
long after this deep dive is over.
long after this is over.
That's right.